want to welcome Susan to our discussion today. Thanks for being with us today.
Oh, thanks, Chris, so much. It's a delight to be with the American Battlefield Trust, an organization I have enormous respect for.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have you with us here. And I have to admit, I like Ike, and I like not only Dwight, but Susan as well. So this is a real kind of a treat for me. For folks who are not familiar with General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, give us just a little bit of background from your perspective about who this giant of the 20th century was.
Well, thank you, Chris. Well, I think he's a rather interesting character. I say this is, of course, I mean, I'm related to him, but I think that the important thing for me was that my parents always told me to separate my relationship with him from who he was in public life. And so that was very helpful. So this is Susan the analyst saying that he had really a remarkable career. There are only really three presidents of the United States who commanded major military operations and had a two-term presidency. And that is Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Dwight Eisenhower. In this particular case, his own journey to the five-star generalship during World War II, he was a Supreme Allied Commander in the European theater, was that he came from a Mennonite Brethren household that settled outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and eventually moved to Kansas. But among the other things that made that interesting is that they were a community of pacifists. So when Dwight Eisenhower went to West Point, there was a collective intake of breath. and I think they didn't really know quite what to make of this young man who really obviously thought for himself. So we can talk more about the war and the presidency, but let me just say that he knew battlefields. And one of those battlefields that he worked on during the First World War was the Gettysburg battlefield, where Camp Colt was established as the first tank training unit in the United States military, a separate branch of the military at that.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's always kind of fascinating to me that, he led a rather nomadic life as he's kind of going up through the ranks. And the one place he decides to settle down when he's finally retired is he makes that return to Gettysburg and makes that his home because of that, as you said, that familiarity with battlefields.
Well, he had a very challenging time at Camp Colt because the government didn't own much federal land at that time. So they were using all of their assets. So if you can imagine, they were running trucks around Pickett's Charge and elsewhere designed to be tanks. I mean, they were a substitute for tanks because there weren't any tanks. But he was teaching the men how to shoot from moving vehicles before they went to the front during World War I. But he got to know the town very well because he also managed the outbreak of Spanish flu influenza in September of 1918. And if you can think about this 27-year-old officer was commanding 10,000 men in the middle of a pandemic while he was trying to train them to go to war during the First War.
Yeah. So let me back up to his decision to go to West Point in the first place, which, coming from his Mennonite background, is a big decision. What makes him decide to go off and pursue a military career coming from that Mennonite background?
Well, first of all, he always loved history, and it turns out that his mother had to lock up his history books because he was in danger of not finishing his chores. But it's a rather interesting story, I think. As I mentioned, those three presidents, Ulysses S. Grant and Dwight Eisenhower, have something else in common, which is they went to West Point for the free education. I think Ike was always sort of bending in the direction of perhaps a military career, but it hadn't occurred to him until one of his friends mentioned to him that this is how he could get through college without requiring any financial assistance, and his parents didn't have the money to put him through college anyway.
How does he do as a student when he's there?
Oh, I would say he was a bit above 50% academically and a bit below 50% from a disciplinary point of view. But you know, he shared that with Ulysses S. Grant too. And both of them were hovering around the same results in their college education. I think part of that is, Chris, that these were men who liked to ask questions. And the military at that time was full of lots of doctrine and very few questions they really wanted to be asking themselves. And so that's where the disciplinary part comes in, always sort of asking, why are we doing it this way? Or this is crazy kind of thing. And that didn't go down very well, but I think West Point recognized that he had huge talents. It turns up on his efficiency reports.
Well, and that's really interesting when you think about, he's questioning doctrine. So when he does go to Camp Colt, like he's got to make up new doctrine. Like this is a brand new technology with tanks. So they've got to figure out the tactics for it. They don't have the equipment to actually use. So that's an interesting set of problems for a guy now who maybe had been pushed back against when he's asking these questions, but now he's got to be the question asker, basically.
Sometimes I wonder if they sent him to Camp Colt as a okay, put your money where your mouth is kind of thing, because right after he got out of West Point, there was a lot of discussion about this new exotic technology, and he wrote a piece for one of the military journals about how the doctrine around tanks was crazy, and that really they should be used as mobile weapons of war, complete with guns, big guns, and people inside them, because the military at that time wanted to use tanks as like mobile storage units. And so Eisenhower and Patton were saying, this is crazy. You can do a lot more with these things. Eisenhower was told if he wrote another article like that for the Army, that he would be in danger of being court-martialed. So the thing is that so then he ends up at Camp Colt. And I think some of it was, a little bit of it might have been, okay, if you're so smart, see if you can train these guys to have any impact on the war in Europe. I'm not sure. Other historians could verify that, but it just seems ironic, having been disciplined in this space, to then be given, at the age of 27, command over this unit, which was its own independent unit, first one.
Yeah. And how would you assess his overall results at Camp Colt?
Well, at the age of 28, he got a Distinguished Service Medal, which was unheard of for somebody that age, for his command of Camp Colt. And I think it was a double award, both for creating out of whole cloth a unit that knew its stuff and also performed overseas very well. And also because of the management of the Spanish flu influenza. He got no instructions from the Army, as far as I know, about how to manage the pandemic. As a matter of fact, the United States war effort tried everything they could to avoid talking about this illness because they were afraid it was going to affect our mobility and our readiness, etc. So he had to create a whole system for how to manage the influenza attack at Camp Colt, including, everyone will appreciate this, quarantining, wearing masks, but these were all created, again, out of whole cloth. He had to go into town and negotiate with the churches and other big institutions, other institutions that had large basements so that people could quarantine there, or they had to find places to put the dead bodies. About, I think, around 150 soldiers lost their lives there, and then how to manage the morale at the camp. There was some rebellion about wearing masks. That won't surprise anybody, right? But, the Army later said that this was best practices in pandemic management. So this was another reason he was recognized as he was.
And both of these, as you mentioned, are huge challenges, unprecedented challenges. He has to deal with them simultaneously. And I think this is where we see Ike's superpowers for the first time, which I think a lot of people underappreciate. Like he's a master at logistics and his ability to kind of handle all these details so that the results seem so, I don't want to say inevitable, but like he gets what he wants because he's done all the back end work. Tell me a little bit about your perception of his logistical powers.
Well, first of all, he did have a number of assignments that really increased his skills around understanding big logistics problems, which comes in very handy during the run up to D-Day, of course, that being the largest integrated military operation in history. This is nationally integrated and also service integrated. So that was very helpful. But I will add something that I think a lot of people don't really know about him. He was a very creative person. He became a fabulous cook, and he liked to cook. My grandmother was happy about that. He became a pretty good amateur painter, and all of these things. But I think he saw that as a way to augment his own thinking. So I noticed in writing my book, I read lots of his diaries, and I noted that every time, or it seemed every time he met somebody and had a conversation with them, if he saw this particular potential in a person, he would mark down and say, this man has extraordinary imagination, or he is a creative thinker. And so I don't know, Eisenhower, if you're going to do something for the first time, it requires a lot of imagination,
Yeah.
and a lot of creativity. If it's all right, I'd just like to add a few more points. He goes on to be the first at many other things, too. He's the first Supreme Commander of Allied forces, period. Ever in warfare, again, of this integrated command. He is the first president of the hydrogen bomb era. The hydrogen bomb was a fact of life when he took office, but there were no rules of the road for it. He was the first commander of NATO. I should have reversed that chronologically. First commander of NATO, then first commander of the hydrogen bomb era, and the first president of the space age. All of these vast changes required being able to think far enough ahead to have some insights into the sustainability of certain policies. And there's still, many of those policies are still what are guiding forces today.
Yeah. And I want to dive into some of those things as our conversation goes. One of the things to me that really stands out as he's trying to figure this out from scratch, and not only on a policy level, but there also really has to be this very clear ethical, moral basis for all that. I mean, because we have this unprecedented technology that we don't know what to do with, whether it's the bomb, it's the space technology. And so understanding from a human point of view what the implications are, and how that affects the policy, to me is, I think, one of the really significant contributions that he makes to laying out that foundation that you talk about.
Well, Chris, that's wonderful that you say that. I mean, I think the human element of all of these things was very important to him. I have a big collection of letters that he wrote his mother-in-law and wrote to various family members, including my own little pile of letters that he sent me, which are kind of fun. But he did write his mother-in-law back in, I think, the 1950s. She had some problem, and he responded to her. She was clearly asking him for his advice, and he said to her, I have always thought that human beings are more emotional and sentimental than they are intellectual or logical.
Mm.
Now, I'm only thinking that if that was his attitude during World War II, it explains how he kept a very fractious alliance together, because, he would look at people's pushback, or he would look at people's reactions to things, and obviously in his head, try and disaggregate where the logic was and how much of it might have related to pride or patriotism or determination to push a view that they'd always held. In other words, that emotional dimension
Right.
was something he was very aware of. And if you'll allow me one other thought here,
Oh yeah.
I got plenty of dinner table observations as a kid because we lived on an adjacent farm to his, and my brother and I were always debating, I don't know, everything at the dining room table. But occasionally, Granddad would pipe in and say, he was the referee kind of, he'd pipe in and say, well, how do you think it looks to the other guy? Now I want to hear an analysis of this.
Mm,
And in my own career, it was very helpful because you don't know how to frame policy or anything else unless you have a clear idea of where everybody in an issue stands and on what basis they are standing there, for emotional reasons, for reasons of pride, humility, humiliation. I mean, so he had a lot of what we call today EQ.
mhm, mhm. So I want to back up just so we can kind of fill in some of the blanks because there's so much here to unpack, and a lot of people don't know about that interwar period of Eisenhower's career. He just suddenly pops up in World War II and leads the Allies to victory. But as you mentioned, he gets us this series of assignments from World War One onward that really position him to be the guy. He doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. Can you trace some of that history for us, and what are the lessons he learns along the way that kind of set him up for later success?
Well, it's sort of hard to say because I think he certainly had some frustrating assignments. The interwar period was one of those kinds of periods where one of rapid change and an attempt at some kind of reconciliation, which clearly failed. And I think he was certainly of the belief, along with his mentor, General Fox Connor, that another war was in the making. Not everybody in Washington agreed with that. So this young, talented person who graduates #1 in his class at Command and General Staff College ends up being assigned to coach football teams. And there was a lot of, I would say, frustration on his part. However, having said that, he did get two assignments that I think were extremely beneficial. One was, of course, this command of Camp Colt and the Tank Corps. So he understood tanks unlike anyone else except George Patton. I mean, the two of them were co-conspirators and trying to bring the Army into the modern era. But also, after World War I, he was, about 10 years later, was sent to France to write a guidebook loosely called The American Battlefields of France. And it turned out that he ended up in the course of writing this guidebook for the military and others, literally visiting every crossroads in the French countryside. So you can imagine when World War II comes around, these two so-called dead-end jobs, right, end up being an enormous plus for somebody who had to manage the overall resources and decisions of the European theater on the Western side. And a lot of that had to do with the performance of tanks and also the terrain. So having had assignments that related to logistics, he had a kind of deep operational knowledge, but then also a talent for the big picture.
And let's talk about that just a little bit because I've lauded his logistical skills. You've just mentioned here he gives himself this operational background, but one of the things that you really make a point of in your book is that he's a big strategic thinker. And so when we talk about logistics, operations, and strategic, we're talking about very narrow versus wider perspectives. Tell me a bit about Eisenhower's ability as a strategic thinker.
Well, I'll give you a good example. First of all, who was going to command D-Day or, the assault on France? That was a big question mark for a while. Many thought that Chief of Staff of the Army, George Marshall, who was really sort of the overall architect of World War II from the American perspective, was thought to be the man who was going to be sent to Europe to do that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to keep Marshall in Washington and to give this assignment to Dwight Eisenhower for a range of reasons, I would argue. But Ike looks at the plan before he even knows he's going to be given this assignment, and he said, "I don't think this is doable. The plan calls for only 3 beaches, and I don't think that there's enough force involved here to undertake the challenge that is posed by having significant potential resistance, not just on the coast of Normandy, but within France itself and across Europe." So he says he's very clever how he does this. He gets his chief land commander, Monty, as he's known, General Montgomery, Bernard Law Montgomery, to go with his own chief of staff, General Bedell Smith, and he sends the 2 of them to argue the case with Churchill. And Churchill, of course, was not very enthusiastic about this cross-channel invasion. More on that later if you're interested. But the bottom line is here, they argued in support of broadening the beaches, but it was Eisenhower's idea that we had to have at least 5 beaches. Otherwise, the Americans would not meet their objectives in Cherbourg in a timely manner. And any glitch or anything that might go wrong, people would be thrown off the beaches and we would fail to succeed. So he won the day on that, and they added Utah Beach and the airborne divisions. And, without that force, and it was tough enough as it was, without that force, we would not have succeeded. So that's the large strategic vision. He had I think, a remarkable sense of sustainability. How should we describe this? Sort of what would work and what wouldn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want to take risks that you're engaging individuals in life or death situations without making sure that there's the kind of backup support required to give a more than a passing potential for success.
I really like the way you frame that. If you're going to put these men in life or death situations, let's make sure there's this chance for success. Again, kind of getting back to that fact that he doesn't forget that there are people involved here, and that sort of human aspect of it, which I think is important. So how does he spend the early part of the war? Because, of course, D-Day doesn't come about until, June of 1944. He's pretty busy before that, though.
Well, a lot of people sort of forget the fact that when he went to the War Plans Department right after Pearl Harbor, he was actually put on the Asia desk and not on the European one, because he wasn't that far from being in the Philippines with General MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur, who was in the Philippines trying to nationalize a Philippine army. And so, that's where his expertise was at that point for about 4 years or so. And then he gets called back to the United States then. And this is really intriguing for people who are not as familiar with the run-up to World War II. The United States of America held the largest war games in the history of our nation, literally took over the entire state of Louisiana in what were called the Louisiana maneuvers. And they had a red team and a blue team, and they fought it out, including using an amphibious landing there in Louisiana. And Ike was the chief of staff to the winning team. It was his strategy that won the Louisiana maneuver. So he's already now, at this point, seriously come to the attention of George Marshall. That's just before Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, Eisenhower is asked to come to War Plans, and he provides the first memo on how to win the war. And again, this was, Marshall took note of this kind of strategic talent. And then in June of 42, he is sent to Europe to command American forces in the European theater. This is before the creation of the Supreme Allied Commander position.
And there was a lot of discussion at that point, like, America's now in the war. Where are we going to deploy our resources? Churchill and FDR had very different views on that. How did Eisenhower, of course, I was going to say, how does he navigate all that? And as a soldier, his navigation is, yes, sir, I'll do what I'm told, sir. But, there are lots of different options. Kind of where is his thinking as all of that's unfolding?
Well, it's very interesting you say about all of these things happening at once. And so if I could just back up a little bit, I teach strategy at the Eisenhower Institute, Gettysburg College, and we have been lucky enough to make several trips to Normandy and to study the grand strategy of World War II and then the specifics of D-Day. We've also made other trips to different parts of the world around subject matter I was intimately involved in. But anyway, the point is, I tell everybody that great strategy is not complicated. I mean, it's so simple, it's complicated. And that, so I was really delighted when a four-star general asked my class, what was the strategy for World War II? And they all piped up in unison, Europe first. I'm so proud of that because I told them this is thinking at higher strategic levels. Europe first, two words, and that means that's how we're going to do it. And underneath those two words are everything is affected by those two words. This means that we put our resources in Europe first, because the determination is that Hitler was a stronger character than the Japanese leadership, including the emperor. And if we could defeat Hitler first, then the rest of it would fall its own way. We had a major two-front war, so you couldn't put equal resources in both theaters. So, Eisenhower was very much of that view too, not realizing that he's going to be over there commanding American forces. As soon as he gets there, because the British by this point are already in dire trouble in North Africa, he is given the command of a number of operations before D-Day, actually commanding people who outranked him in their own military. So that required a certain EQ as well to gain enough credibility with those individuals to be able to carry the day and go on to the big assignment, which was the cross-channel invasion.
Now we say Europe first, but we do end up in North Africa, and then as Patton kind of moves up into Italy, and again, that's not Hitler, that's Mussolini. But a lot of this is so that the Allies can plan for that big invasion that we talked about a little earlier too. We need the time to get the resources together to do that. How does Eisenhower sort of navigate?
Chris, there's another dimension too, which is North Africa and Italy, and these are also compromises with the British.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the reason I say that is today we have this idea that I'm digging my heels in and I'm not going to compromise on anything. And I have to tell you that the book that has not been written, and I'm probably not the one who's going to write it, but I'd like to invite anybody to write a fascinating book on how many compromises we made during World War II on the way we looked at something. And in the end, the sum total of it was probably way better than it would have been if only one country had had input. And so anyway, that's just a thought about North Africa and Italy. We were going around, we were buying time, yes, to a large degree. But having said that, even after we decided on the cross-channel invasion, that was largely a US Soviet confluence of pressure on the British. They were still, I should say, at the Churchill level, not enthused about another channel crossing.
Yeah. So Eisenhower pulls together this invasion, it changes the momentum of the war. But you talked about he'd wanted more than 3 beaches because there might be problems, and there are certainly problems. Like he comes up with this great plan, but every plan holds true till you get punched in the face, right? And so, how does he adapt? Because again, I think that's another of his really key strengths is his adaptability.
Yeah, well, one of my favorite stories in the adaptability front is the liberation of Paris, because you might be familiar with the fact that the Allies did not want to liberate Paris and end up having to occupy Paris because troops are there to, the mission was to advance into Germany and bring about the end of Nazi power, not to occupy a major metropolitan area with all of the local politics that go with that. So actually, I would say that Ike didn't actually directly violate orders, but he took the military decision after D-Day to go ahead and support Charles de Gaulle, General de Gaulle, who was rather controversial in Allied circles, and to support him as the successor to the occupiers, to try and pull Paris and France together. And I think he does something very insightful here. He allows the French divisions to go into Paris first. The appearance being that the French were liberating themselves.
Yeah.
Then we went in afterwards, and we really did not. This was a way of supporting de Gaulle and to be building on restoring French morale, because we could see that they were going to be partners soon, hopefully, and into the future. And then what I love about this story is that he sends American divisions in after the French divisions, and they march straight through Paris, through the Champs-Élysées, out the other side into combat the next day.
Yeah.
But the Parisians think that they've come to stay. And so it gave the appearance of occupying France long enough for General de Gaulle to gain control over the situation. So that's a great example of a strategy that solved more than one problem. Securing Paris and also giving the appearance that the Americans were there. Standing back and letting de Gaulle, take the applause. That took a lot of emotional courage, I think, as tempting as it might have been. Anyway, it's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah. Well, and your own background is in strategic communications, and so just the idea of appearances and what are the implications of that. I mean, that's a masterstroke. A masterstroke.
That's a masterstroke, and I have to say that I've had I had an unusual upbringing. I have to say that would be probably an understatement here. But I had the opportunity to meet General de Gaulle, and actually President de Gaulle, as he was. He came back after the war later in the late 50s as president of the Republic to try and straighten out his country that was struggling again. And I saw the relationship between him and my grandfather. And it's very interesting. Of all of the people who posed challenges to Dwight Eisenhower in one way or the other, there was some kind of understanding between the two of them. And as a matter of fact, President de Gaulle came to my grandfather's funeral in his wartime military uniform.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So, without getting sort of into the nitty gritty of how the war ends, I mean, certainly Ike sees that the end is coming, but the work isn't finished. How does he then shift gears to get ready for that ending in that post-war period?
Well, I think you see a hint of that within weeks of the end of the war, but he went to Ordorf, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald. One of the terrible camps that was central to the whole network of Holocaust facilities, and I think was so extraordinarily shocked by what he saw that he went back to the headquarters where he was staying. It was Patton's headquarters, and wrote to General Marshall and said, "I want everybody you can find to come to Europe. This is members of Congress, journalists, etc. He said the same thing to Churchill, and we have to chronicle this because he said nobody will ever believe it happened. 50 years from now, nobody will believe this happened. So my father, who was in combat in Europe during World War II, was sent to Buchenwald, and he was told to bring his camera. He was an amateur photographer anyway, and he put together a whole album that's still in family hands of the horrors of this, just because he told me, he told my generation and my children and my grandchildren. He had the opportunity to know some of my grandchildren, and he said, this is what, this is what you have to know. And so to be thinking 50 years out when you're in the middle of a shocking experience, I think is also rather telling about the way his brain worked.
And there are many things about Ike that I admire, and I think that's probably the thing I admire most about him was that he went and he bore witness and he said, we absolutely have to see this and make sure that people don't forget it because it's so horrific. People won't believe that it happened, you know?
Yeah, well, the other thing I'd add to that is, how people always say, well, my job description says this and that. Well, the truth of the matter, it was not in his job description to be having this chronicled. The other thing that I noted when I wrote my book and was interested in this is that after the war, when he was commander of the occupation in the American sector, in Berlin, actually, he wasn't in Berlin yet, but he said to his staff, if 50 years from now, Germany is a prosperous democracy, we will know we have succeeded. Who talks and thinks like that? Well, people who were in the middle of dire set of circumstances. But there was always, back to your earlier point, Chris, there was always this human factor. So that meant that a lot of things had to be arranged in a certain way so that, we could begin to build bridges again, as horrendous as all of that was.
So I'm sure the war ends. I'm sure he experiences the same relief that the rest of the world does, but he doesn't take a victory lap. He understands we still have some stuff to do here. How does he kind of then work through that next period of helping the world get back on its feet?
Well, I think the correspondence with my grandmother is pretty amusing. He keeps writing and saying, I can't wait to retire to the farm and go fishing, and then maybe I'll make an arrangement with some local college and I can teach history or something like I don't know about that. It might have been a nice idea, but that certainly wasn't in the cards for some time. So so he did, after he became chief of staff of the army and had to work towards bringing home all of these troops that were still kind of stranded in Europe and in the Far East, understanding that we could not leave completely because new challenges were presenting themselves, as they did eventually in Korea, etc. He did go to Columbia University, where he was the university president there. And then President Truman appointed him as the first military commander, first SACEUR of NATO. And he went and created that job too. And that was all about trying to win the peace. And so I think the chief impetus for him deciding to run for president ultimately was the party he chose was the one that needed to be reformed. It was the Republican Party that was populated by some very activist isolationists. He was hoping that they were going to agree that there was a global leadership role for the United States, but certainly the most likely person to win the Republican nomination, Robert Taft, didn't want to support NATO, didn't want to support the United Nations, didn't want to support a range of things. So Eisenhower ultimately decided that he would have to run for president if he wanted to save everything he'd worked for.
Yeah. It's a really interesting period because everyone's sort of thinking he's going to run for president, but nobody even knows if he's a Republican or a Democrat. He ends up having a very strained relationship with President Truman as a result of all that. he answers the call to service and becomes president. How does he then handle his period as president of the United States?
Well, I have to say quickly, the strained relationship with Truman is that Truman twice offered to step down so that Dwight Eisenhower could run for president in his place,
Yeah.
and then was shocked to find out that he actually was going to run as a Republican. And I think that was probably the basis of the strain. And then of course, he had some challenge in getting the nomination from the Republican Party, but managed to do that and then won in a landslide. So then he comes to the White House, and there are a lot of big challenges on, including, by the way, ending the Korean War. And I should say very quickly, Chris, is something I think about a lot, is that he didn't think that small wars were worth the risk, because I mean, depending on the circumstances, but he always noted the danger of small wars that would get bigger. And he used to say, in the nuclear age, everything has changed. So people today who try and compare the wars we're facing here with World War II, there's one very large missing ingredient, and it's called nuclear weapons. Yeah. And he rather interestingly got into a helicopter and flew over the front in Korea. And as a military man, came back and said, after he'd consulted with others too, but came back and said, this isn't a winnable war. We're going to bleed ourselves dry financially, and it could lead to a nuclear confrontation. So that is the origin of the armistice in July of 1953. And then he set about trying to create the conditions and the frameworks that would assure peace and prosperity. And I personally am very proud of the fact that not one American serviceman lost his life after the end of the Korean War, during his administration, I should say.
And I know one way to characterize his presidency is, 8 years of uninterrupted prosperity and peace. And I like that story a lot. But I think that if we also think, like, he's also fighting the Cold War, which is just a different kind of war. As you say, we're not losing servicemen, but he has to figure out how to do this. Nobody had to fight this kind of war before. What sort of marks do you give him for navigating this new type of conflict?
Well, a lot of people who are, well, first of all, it was a multidimensional approach. So today we have a tendency to think about military strategy mostly, but he had a very robust diplomatic set of activities, including the creation of the United States Information Agency and others. In other words, it was important for America to be telling its story, not necessarily to the Soviet Union, though, of course, we did broadcast into the Soviet Union, but important too for the rest of the world to understand who we were, what our values were, and what we were trying to accomplish. And I think that's important. I get a little bit, I get concerned about people who are critical of various aspects of policy, not just in his administration, but later. Because what we don't know, and there was a time that we had some opportunity to learn more, but we don't anymore. And that is what the Soviet Union was doing at the same time. So we tend to criticize certain aspects of policy through our own lens only, without understanding, what kind of infiltration of other countries the Soviet Union was in the middle of, and what their psychological operations were, and who their agents were, and this and that. And all of that, of course, by necessity, has to operate behind, classified labels in not just in the Soviet Union, but in the United States too. At the end of his administration, there was a very tough time where he was being accused of being soft on the Soviet Union without an adequate number of missiles and bombers to protect ourselves against Soviet aggression. And the president couldn't talk about what was really going on in terms of the innovations within the administration, because it was all classified information. So it was like a one-sided conversation without a full understanding of the complexity and the depth of the steps that were being taken.
And I think complicating all that too is sort of the cloud of the Red Scare and the
Right.
political domestic implications that that has. What sort of marks do you give him for navigating that bit of craziness?
Well, again, knowing a little bit about family dynamics, I really sort of love the McCarthy story because Joseph McCarthy had been a thorn in the side of certainly Harry Truman and the Truman administration, and Senator McCarthy was still around accusing people who had not had due process of all kinds of things during the Great Red Scare. But when Eisenhower gets to be president, this is amazing. For the year and a half that he had to deal with Joseph McCarthy, he did not mention Senator McCarthy's name. After he was elected president, did not mention his name once during that period. And he was under a lot of criticism. As a matter of fact, his brother and confidant was urging him to take McCarthy on. And Ike said, well, President Eisenhower said, well, what McCarthy wants is attention. And he wants to rise to the level of the presidency, and I'm not going to give him what he wants. And then he said about creating a behind-the-scenes strategy to convince other members of his party that they finally censure the Republican senator from Senator McCarthy. So that it's so resonant with today.
Yeah.
That actually attention is what most people seek, right? So if you want to make sure that somebody like Senator McCarthy could never, say that he had challenged the president and the president responded. Therefore, he's somehow at the presidential level. He never got that opportunity. So the president instead would go around the country and talk about American values with a very obvious reference to the things that Senator McCarthy was doing, but without accidentally mobilizing McCarthy's supporters to support McCarthy even more. That's the thing.
Yeah, yeah. Another key figure in Ike's life at this point is his vice president, Richard Nixon. You want to talk a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, well, I mean, I got to know President Nixon later in life, but I can only speak to what I've read in other works of scholarship. I think there are a couple of noteworthy things. Let's remember that Richard Nixon is about John Kennedy's age, so the torch was going to be passed to a new generation no matter what, because Eisenhower was the end of the older generations, the post-war commanding generations. So that torch is going to be passed. But still, I mean, think of how young Kennedy was. Think of how young Nixon was. So the fact that they didn't have a social, personal relationship, I don't think tells you anything, which is where the scholarship is really important on this, because I would make nothing of the fact that the Nixons hadn't been invited for a weekend at the Gettysburg farm. The Gettysburg farm was not used for, the only people who came to spend the night were people that President Eisenhower wanted to really study, like the first Prime Minister of India stayed overnight in the Eisenhower farm because Ike wanted to build a kind of relationship. I think he relied on Nixon for a lot. And in the end, tried to do what President Obama's doing now, which is to stay above the fray. I don't think you can make too much of that either. So I'm going to leave it up to historians to decide this and that. But I want to say one more thing, which is really important, since we're now thinking about election or conventions, is that in those days, the party elders played a much bigger role in the choice of vice president. And Eisenhower did not really know Nixon before he was put on the ticket. And so he certainly identified some of Nixon's talents, which were to balance the ticket And also, he showed a flair for international relations.
So when he finally does get ready to leave the presidency, he leaves us that very famous warning against the military-industrial complex, which a lot of people found surprising since he had been a general. Were his words prescient or not?
Oh, I think they're very prescient. As a matter of fact, some of his associates who I got to know long after Granddad's death, they used to say, well, we're looking at it now, aren't we? Um, I think it was prescient. You know, the thing that really, Chris, impressed me about my grandfather's, I look back as his career again as an analyst, um, is that he didn't mind taking on his own group.
Hmm.
He took on his own party to try and completely reform them. He took on you could say, his German American ethnic group by A, going to West Point, and then B, defeating the Nazis in Western Europe. And he took on, he took on his military establishment. And I really admired that. I mean, I admired as an analyst. We need more people trying to reform who they're associated with. And it's very hard to change the behavior of other people, but if you set a finer example, then that can be extremely persuasive. And I think, we'll see exactly how many people, have taken that lesson going forward. But, he wasn't afraid to be self-critical first. And I saw, plenty of evidence of that directly later in my youth.
So we've got a number of questions. I'll shift to those in just a second here, but let me just ask you one final question here. And he finally gets to retire and finally gets to go live in that farm that he wanted to live in all his life. He chooses Gettysburg because he'd spent so much time there. How would you characterize his retirement years?
Well, first of all, I've got to say he was a great writer. He really was. And his book, At Ease, Stories I Tell to Friends, is so readable. It is such a joyful book in so many ways. And there's some very funny stories in it. But my father used to say, the reason that book is so good is because he wrote every word of that himself. And it sort of has a kind of authenticity. So he did do a lot of writing in his retirement years. He played a lot of golf and enjoyed himself, but he did give a lot of speeches around the country. And interesting that he never took a speaking honorarium, and he never sat on a corporate board, and he never had any clients. He felt that anybody who had the privilege of serving his country should do that gratis. He was what we call today a servant leader, and so. He enjoyed that. He even came to speak to my school, and he went to all of his grandchildren's schools. And I'm not sure that in the 1960s people knew quite what to make of him, but it was fun anyway.
Like every picture I see of him, like when he's in service, he always looks like he's having a good time talking to the troops, like a real people person. So
he's a people person.
yeah.
I think also the other thing is that there's always an attempt to think that he was frustrated and angry and this and that. I didn't see any evidence of it, and I spent a lot of time with him. I think he had a kind of fatalistic streak, which is probably what got him through the whole thing.
Yeah.
Because I never saw any evidence of cynicism or anger or anything like that. And I think that's what you have to do if you're going to be responsible for people's lives on the level he was.
Yeah.
Is that you have to think that all you can do is your very best and be surrounded by people who are every bit as good as you are, if not better. And to just have faith that you've done your best. And I don't know what more a person can do. And I think that was pretty much his attitude.
So I'm going to shift over here to questions. I lied though. I do have one final question I want to ask you before we shift the Q&A. We've been talking to Susan, the analyst. Can I ask you to maybe put on your hat as Susan, the granddaughter, to sort of, as you think about your grandfather today, what thoughts would you share with us?
Well, I get quite emotional about it. He was absolutely the sweetest man in the world. So the thing that I find extraordinary is that somebody who was as tough as he had to be. And boy, I'll tell you, there were times he had to be tough, and it makes, your hair stand on end. right? But at the heart of it, literally at the heart of it, he was such a generous, kind man. He designed jewelry for my grandmother. I won a little walk trot competition with a little dinky cup about this big. And, about 2 weeks later, after its disappearance, it reemerged. He'd had it put on a pedestal with a letter about how important it was that I'd taken on the big challenge to learn about riding and things like that. I mean, he was always doing sweet, thoughtful things, and also for people who couldn't do anything for him. And I think he gets that from his religion, from his spirituality, from his mother, from his family life. And it's something that made one understand really the core of the person. And that's part of what I wanted to convey in my book.
So I would encourage folks to go check out Susan's book. Lots of stuff we didn't even have time to cover today, including Brown versus Board of Education and civil rights stuff. Susan's covered it really well in her book, and some great leadership lessons that folks can take.
And may I add, also hearing Dwight Eisenhower in his own words, he was so good at so many things, and I'm afraid that he was the best writer in the family too, but that's okay.
Susan, it's been a real privilege to sit down and chat with you today. Thanks so much.
It's been a pleasure. And again, I've been so honored to speak to so many teachers doing so many important things just to keep history and the English language alive, and to continue to work hard for rising generations in this country.
Well, thank you so much. On behalf of Doug and Sarah behind the scenes, I'm Chris Mackowski for the American Battlefield Trust. Thanks for being with us. This will be on CVent for the next 90 days, and then we'll move it over to the ABT website. Thanks for all you do to support battlefield preservation and education.